Welcome to Your Truth Revealed, a video podcast that explores your hidden physical and mental health potential. I'm Erika Marcoux, and I share with you the power of self-knowledge. I interview industry professionals to talk about how you can be your own health expert. You're watching episode 9, Know Your Development. This is the first part of an interview with Dr. Renee Rogers. We talk about the developmental stages of life from childhood to adulthood that relate to leadership.
It's kind of easy for everybody to get that children go through stages of development, but sometimes we kind of take for granted that once we grow up, we stay the same. We're not really aware of the evolution of consciousness.
My guest today is Renee Rogers. She has a PhD in Human Resources and Organizational Development from the University of Texas at Austin and a master's degree in Applied Linguistics from San Francisco State University. Renee has served in executive level positions, leading various functions in human resources for over 25 years. She is a certified professional coach and consults leaders and teams in her practice. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And in meeting you, I found it fascinating when you describe the stages of life from childhood, adulthood, and even death. And it's also interesting how these stages define leadership. You taught me about Robert Kegan. Mm-hmm. He's a developmental psychologist and was a professor in adult learning and professional development at Harvard. And he describes stages of development. Can you please describe what developmental stages are in general?
Yes, Kegan's a big name, but there are many others who have worked broadly in this field of adult development. Sometimes it's called cognitive constructivist development. Okay. In general, it's a way of understanding the journey that we make as human beings from our childhood and then especially into development and into our adulthood. It's kind of easy for everybody to get that children go through stages of development because we've had kids, we've seen children change. We know that a 2-year-old is qualitatively different in the way they experience the world than a 7-year-old and a teenager. But sometimes we kind of take for granted that once we grow up, we stay the same.
Which we don't.
We're not really aware of the evolution of consciousness in our adult lives. And partly it's because it takes a long time. You know, I'm looking back on my life. I'm 69. You know, it's a lot of years, a lot of experiences, and it's sometimes only with the benefit of hindsight that we can see that process of development. Mm-hmm. But in general, there's sort of a basic way to think about development, and that is a kind of journey of exploring and integrating in a deep personal way a paradox or a polarity. Mm-hmm. And that is that it is true that we are individual, unique, separate human beings. And at the same time, we are also social, collective, embedded, whole entities that operate within a larger context.
Right.
And so the journey of a development, in many ways, at least the way I understand it best from my own experience, but also as these adult development theorists describe, is really kind of moving from one stage to the next by integrating at a deeper and higher level of consciousness level what it means to be an individual, what it means to be part of a collective. Mm-hmm. We start out, being born, and we come into this world. This kind of gets into the stages. When we're born, there's really not a separation between us and the outside world. Babies are not separate from their mothers. There's this sense of complete embeddedness. And it's not really until, say age 2 and the classic terrible too is when...
Where everything is no.
Exactly.
Rejection.
Exactly. Nope, that's not me.
Right.
And so that's like maybe the beginning of this trying to understand ourselves as human beings separate.
So is that the first time that as human beings we start to individuate?
I think so.
Okay.
And that is what's so charming and frustrating about that phase, or the terrific too, some people like to say. So children continue to do this oscillation, and Piaget has laid out those stages of development.
And can you describe Piaget?
Well, that's a whole story in and of itself, but basically at age 7, there's more of an embeddedness up until adolescence, where you have kind of a repeat of that first individuation, but it's much, much greater. So it's a kind of individuation from the family, from everything that shaped us, to an exploration of a new level of embeddedness with peers and with outside groups that we begin to be. So, and that's a painful period for many adults, as a matter of fact. When we finally start talking about adult development, it's really about when we first leave that home that we know, the family, the community that we're born into, and we move away. So, for those of us who have privileged lives, we may go to college. It may be the first job that people move into. It's the first time moving away. And it's a really, really important transition. It actually, if you think about the evolution of mankind, it was a huge leap because it's a time when we begin to define ourselves as a member of the collective. We begin to find out who we are as we meet the expectations and demands of the world around us. And it can take a long, long time. In fact, the people who work in this area would say the majority of people don't really even move beyond this stage, and they live happy, productive lives. But we learn how to be workers, for example. It's a period of expansive knowledge and learning, because we are adding all these skills that make us able to cope with and be successful in the world. So we may identify with a profession at that point, like we're an engineer and we think like an engineer, and we begin to shape by that profession, or any number of others. We may become very influenced by and allow ourselves to be shaped by religious institutions. It's a period where we also learn how to be in relationship. So we learn how to be a husband or a wife, or a significant other. We learn how to parent and what it means to be a parent. You can see why, from the point of view of the evolution of humans, it's like a huge step forward, right? Some people move into that kind of effortlessly, and other people have a hard time.
Right.
It's and who knows why that is? Maybe personality, temperament, or whatever. But everybody moves into that kind of socialized stage of development. And then for some of us, things happen. And that way of holding the world is all of a sudden too small to cope with the reality that we're experiencing. So it can happen in some tragic ways. It can happen with a loss, a divorce. It can happen because we're put in a leadership role. And all of a sudden that socialized approach to seeking answers outside ourselves becomes inadequate. And so especially a leader may find themselves going, nobody's got an answer for me here. I've got to come up with that answer.
Right.
And so that's the period where we start to believe, rather than being defined by others, I got to pick up this pen and write my own story. It's a time of exploration of our purpose for being here, of the values that we hold, of what really matters most to us as really defined by ourselves. So it's a really exciting time.
Yeah.
And it's a time of really claiming power in a constructive way.
So are all the stages in general, because we're taking a more general approach to this right now, where the paradox is being autonomous and belonging to a group, and that we vacillate between that?
Well, it's more like each stage marks a movement to the opposite polarity.
So every stage is the opposite.
Right.
Gotcha.
So there's individuation, in adolescence, and there's a move to the collective in socialized self.
Okay.
Then we can get stuck there. Like with every polarity, both are true. So now in terms of growth and development, we have to oscillate back. And we have to redefine what it means to be an individual self. But this time it's in a higher consciousness. It's not what it's like to be an adolescent. It's what it's like to be a deeply self-motivated, values-driven, purpose-driven adult.
Right. Can you give your own definition of what consciousness is? That's a loaded question.
Well, there's so many ways to talk about it.
Right.
I mean, this model that we're using is a very cognitive model. It very much speaks to the way we make sense of the world and the way we understand ourselves in the world. It's a meaning-making model.
Okay.
And so one could argue that consciousness in this context is that larger collective sense of who we are.
Okay.
And our relationships with ourselves, with others, and with the world, and then eventually with the universe. You know, not that it goes in such a linear way.
Right.
Right.
Well, you had mentioned that it's like a spiral.
It is like a spiral.
Like it just keeps.
And each time we're really exploring and integrating the polarity in a deeper way personally and in a more expansive way in our consciousness and the way we think about it. And why do we even do it? I mean, that's
good question.
Why bother?
Right.
Why don't we just go to that first one and stay there? And it really goes to the question of what we're called to do, I think, because it's like we can no longer make sense of the world with the consciousness that we hold.
Okay.
And
we outgrow it.
And there's really demands on us. The relationship with life is critically important, because if life didn't demand us to keep going, you know, we might get lazy and just stay where we are.
Good point.
And some people are more curious than others. Why are some people wired to always be asking those deeper questions of life? I don't know. But
yeah, do you have the answer for that?
No, I don't.
That would be helpful.
I do think that there's, circumstances, serendipity will conspire to invite us to keep moving forward and understand this fundamental paradox of I'm me and I'm us at the same time.
At the same time.
And like with any paradox, you can spend a long time arguing one side and equally on the other. So you have to give homage to each one.
Exactly. And that's wholeness, even approaching life holistically.
Yeah. And understand it's not over, you
Right.
You just keep going. And Kim Wilber has talked a lot about this, the idea of lines of development. So development isn't monolithic. We have social development, cognitive development, spiritual development, social development. Each of those are distinct lines, and the journey in each one of those will be different.
It's just showing that we can be very evolved in one area and less evolved in others.
Exactly.
And then again, I keep going back to that integration, the whole self. Exactly.
And that's why it takes a long time, because you're like integrating a lot of different lines. All those different aspects of our being begin to coalesce into a mindset that equips you to live in the complexity of the world as you perceive it.
Yes. Which is always changing.
Exactly.
Robert Keegan talks about the 5 stages of development. So stage 1 is childhood. Stage 2 is adolescence, which he also calls self-sovereign. Stage 3 is adult, which is the socialized self. Stage 4 is the adult again, the self-authoring self. And stage 5, his last stage, is the adult self-transforming self. And I would love to take a deep dive into all 5 of these stages. And you've already touched a bit on childhood, but one of the things in learning more about the 5 stages is that it's distinctive in that it's purely impulsive. or reflex driven?
And on a course of maturation where there's more self-control and more, as they get older.
Well, and one thing that I've noticed, is with children, and I'm sure it's probably the same for adults too, but it's like one step forward, two steps back, where there's that that regression to a younger stage, and then I try to move forward a little bit more.
I think that's a good way to describe the whole process of development that never ends.
Yeah,
because it's not really a linear path.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we talked about the stage 1 of childhood. Can we go a little bit deeper now into adolescence and self-sovereign?
Adolescence is another whole topic. There are people who get stuck there. The self-sovereign. That's my will be done, and and I'm the king. It's a willfulness that is long outlasted its usefulness.
The sense of self is ruled by their needs and wishes, not necessarily by others.
Right. And so in an organization, in terms of leadership, that would translate into a very extreme kind of authoritarian, autocratic leader. I think that it's no longer possible for pure self-sovereign leaders to make it in organizations.
Okay. Is that the needs and wishes of others are relevant only to the extent that they support those of that person. Right. And effectively, the person and others inhabit two separate worlds.
Yeah. And you can see that with teenagers, for example, in the extreme rebellion or rejection of anything that the parent thinks is right or important. It's a stage that we forgive teenagers for. We don't forgive adults for it for very long.
Right. Nor should we.
Yeah, really. It's society, evolution calls for us to at least move into the socialized stage, to at function. Least be able to function within a community and a collective.
Yeah. The next stage is the adult socialized self.
Right.
Can you share more about that?
That's that big leap, and that's where when we move away and from home, go into college, join a profession, form relationships, build our own families. It's a stage of really discovering who we are in a context of the other. A lot of our identity is shaped by meeting the expectation.
So that's more belonging to a group then. So the adolescent stage is autonomous.
Individuation.
And then we're moving back into that group mentality, that embeddedness.
Yeah, that being part of the whole. We can stay in that stage a long time. Many people don't really leave it. I mean, they live happy, productive lives.
For the rest of their life in that stage.
Yeah. But others, by circumstances, by the experience of life, by role, for example, a leadership role, begin to run up against the limits of defining everything outside themselves.
Well, I found it very interesting that the socialized self, it's based on the real or imagined expectations of others. I think about stories about, my dad expected me to be an attorney, and that didn't really fit with my personality, and it's that kind of conflict. Whether it was really important to that dad or not, but it's that real or imagined expectation.
Exactly. Meeting those expectations.
Meeting them.
And an imagined expectation can be just as powerful as a real one.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's a little bit what we begin to grow out of. And and it becomes a limit. It's like, that's not all I want to be. I want to be more than that.
Right.
The socialized self, it's where we form our attachment to the idea of patriarchy, of hierarchies.
Tell me more.
Who's the first other we look up to? Parents. And all of us, actually, at some time or another, hold the belief that just because someone's at a higher level of power and status in an organization, that they somehow know more. Well, sometimes they know a little more because they get access to the information. But we look outside ourselves up for answers. Yeah. And we're disappointed if we don't get them. Right? And so that becomes a whole mindset that really works against empowerment in organizations. It's a whole assumption about the way the world works.
One of my aims is to help empower the listener to not just look at a doctor and say, "Oh, you have all the answers for me."
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's not an empowering position to be in.
Our image of the doctor is the ultimate extension of of a patriarchy mindset. The notion of the doctor collaborating with you is a new idea. Expertise can be an idea that we pay deference to. Age.
Absolutely.
Certainly power. And so all those things work extremely well for a while, then they stop working. So we start wanting to understand it differently. What that means is we need to cycle back to the other polarity. We've gone too far.
We've gone too far, so we need to become more autonomous.
We go back and we begin to understand what it means to be autonomous, an individual, self-motivated as opposed to other-directed. This transition spurs a lot of life coaching. What's my purpose? A lot of people don't know. I would say most of my clients don't know. We do that job that looked like a good idea when we were right in the middle of our socialized self, and all of a sudden it starts losing its meaning. And we go, I don't have the energy and the mojo to keep doing this. You know, I need something more. This can't be the end of my life. What begins then is a search for purpose.
So this is stage 4, again, the adult, which is the self-authoring self. The sense of self is determined by a set of values that they have authored for themselves, and that most adults rarely achieve this.
They don't really see the need to do anything differently. They're perfectly happy. One of the things that I've had to work with in myself, because I've been a developmental coach, is letting go of the idea that one is better than the other. And so the polarity idea helps me because they're both true.
Right.
The way in which we're a total, complete part of the other is true, and the way in which we're individuals is true. We can't get from socialized to self-authoring without going through the portal of socialized.
And the other part of that, using the spiral diagram, is that the self-authoring self includes the socialized self, the self-sovereign self, and the child.
You don't leave anything behind. You include and expand. It's a progression from really that same kind of oscillation development from the very beginning, from childhood. There really is a sense that you're building on life experience in a way that makes you a more developed, a more, I say, evolved human.
Let's look at the last stage, which is stage 5, and that, again, is the adult, the self-transforming self.
There is an aspect of age. It takes some time to move into self-transforming. I feel like there's something to do with years of living life that helps out with this adult development thing. It's, again, another embedded stage.
Okay.
It's a move because self-authoring is individual. Self-transforming is a stage where you begin to realize, and often it comes with feedback, you begin to realize that your vision, even your set of values, are not enough. You need the interaction and the co-creation of others to be able to be effective in the complexity that you're living with.
Well put.
So this is really tough for leaders. People are pretty successful who get to this stage. And so there's a real resistance to let go of what has worked. But what starts to happen is that the context, let's take it in an organizational life, is just way too complex. There's too many paradoxes going on. There are too many polarities. There's too many competing truths operating in a given situation. Frankly, nobody knows the answer. And I'm talking about massive problems in the world, like global warming. We're all over our heads in terms of being able to live with the world we have created. In organizations, we're all over our head in terms of the complexity we're dealing with continuing to grow or continuing to have the same profit margins or finding that new innovative product. Nobody knows the answer. And so what we begin to understand is the only answer is a deeply collaborative co-creation in the moment where we all become really open to safe to fail experiments that nudge us in the right direction. Nothing's ultimately true, right? Other than what's in the moment and the quality of the relationships people have with each other to be able to co-create a new world.
That gives me chills.
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
Our organizations they struggle with it.
Speaking of development, it takes a lot of energy to be your best self. Our featured product for this episode is Reishi Extract Mushroom Complex by Life Extension. The medicinal reishi mushroom boosts your body's natural defenses and supports healthy immune function. This mushroom has been used for centuries in traditional Chinese medicine. Go to yourtruthrevealed.com/store and use promo code TRUTH for a 20% discount. After watching this episode, what's one of your developmental milestones? Please post your answer in the comments below and check out some great resources in the description. For more learning, download your free worksheet on my website, yourtruthrevealed.com. Make sure you subscribe and click the bell to be the first to know about upcoming episodes. Tune in for episode 10. It's the continuation of this interview with Dr. Renee Rogers.
The reactive mindset is very disempowering. It's really a barrier to greater effectiveness because a manager, to be effective in the complexity of today's world, has to be able to empower not only themselves but more and more people to do work.
I'm Erika Marcoux. Thanks for watching.